Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
I get a lot of questions about every week on trying to understand 510K process, what's entailed, when should I do it, what's the timing of my product development efforts for preparing and submitting a 510K, what's this refuse to accept checklist, should I be aware of that? Lots of things that certainly I think would be helpful for you to listen to this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. This is your host, founder, and VP of Quality and Regulatory at Greenlight Guru, John Spear. And the topic of this conversation is really about 510K. What is it? High level. What do I need to do? What are some of the steps in my process? And again, we're not going to solve every single nuance of a 510K submission today, but I have a fair number of conversations on a weekly basis with folks that are not entirely clear as to what I need to include and exclude, and what are the steps, and what are the sections, and what is this refuse to accept thing. So I thought, who better to talk with me about a general 510K process other than Mike Drews. Mike is president of Vascular Sciences and a familiar guest on the Global Medical Device Podcast. So Mike, welcome.
Thank you, John. Always a pleasure to speak with you and your audience.
All right. So we talk a fair amount about regulatory submissions, and we've talked a time or two about 510Ks and things of that nature. So I thought today, let's just kind of maybe do a super high level recap of what a 510K is and when it's appropriate and applicable. And then we can start to dive into some of the quote process steps that a company should be in tune with as they try to get their products cleared through the FDA process. So I guess start high level. 510K, what is it? When should I consider this as a pathway?
Okay, John. So to start out at a high level, a 510K is one of a number of pathways to market that a company can choose to bring a medical device onto the market here in the United States. What sets the 510K apart from all of the other pathways, there's essentially two criteria. One is the device has to be less than class 3, which means that it has to be class 2 or below. And we've talked about classification many times. That's criteria for 510K number 1. Criteria for 510K number 2 is it needs to be substantially equivalent. In other words, basically the same as another device, what we call a predicate device, that's already on the market here in the United States. It must be here in the U.S. You can't make a substantial equivalence argument to a device that has a CE mark in the EU, for example. And when I say substantial equivalence, John, what I mean by that is substantially equivalent in terms of labeling as well as technology. So we have to show that our device is basically the same, not necessarily exactly the same, but basically the same as another predicate device in terms of labeling and technology. So it has to be below class 3. It has to be substantially equivalent. If you can tick those two boxes, then a 510K is certainly a pathway to market that you should consider.
Yeah, I don't want to dictate to folks that this is the only path for product that meets that definition. Again, I would encourage you all to listen to some of the other episodes of the Global Medical Device Podcast, where Mike and I talk a lot about regulatory strategy. And certainly there's times where, 510K is a good path from a strategy standpoint, and other times where you may want to consider an alternate regulatory pathway. So if you have any questions, comments, want some feedback on that, Mike Drews is a pro at this. So I would encourage you all to connect with him to understand what makes the most sense from your overall strategy, whether or not 510K makes the most sense. So keep that in your back pocket, folks. Mike Drews is here to help you with that.
Well, John, thank you for those kind words. I know
sure.
we were going to keep this high level, but if I could just kick it up a notch or two temporarily. I mentioned the two criteria for a 510K, one being less than class 3, the other being substantially equivalent. If your device is substantially equivalent, It doesn't necessarily mean that you must do a 510K. It doesn't necessarily preclude you from doing something else, like, for example, de novo. There are many medical devices that I've worked on in the past, and I'm sure this is the same for you, John, where the decision between a 510K versus de novo could have gone either way, and there could be advantages, for example, competitive advantages, where even if the company thinks they have a good chance of doing a 510K, they might opt to consider a de novo for competitive reasons, and perhaps even in some extreme cases, they might even opt to consider doing a PMA for similar competitive reasons. So as we've talked about many times, John, at least in my regulatory world, nothing is black and white. There's always a lot of different options.
Yeah, I had the urge to say BAM because when you said kick it up a notch, it reminded me of Emeril Lagasse and his cooking show.
Emeril Lagasse, that's correct.
All right. So there's also a few different flavors of 510Ks. And I know I'd say the workhorse, if you will, of the regulatory pathways, at least in the U.S., is the traditional 510K. But there's also a couple different flavors of 510Ks. Can you maybe compare and contrast abbreviated versus special versus traditional when one might apply over the other?
Sure. The most common type of 510K, as you just mentioned, John, is what we call the traditional 510K. And this is when we're bringing a new medical device onto the market. Now, I'm sure, John, you and our audience both appreciate that when we say a new device is a 510K, that's a bit of an oxymoron to begin with.
Yeah.
But what I mean by that is a device that has not already been found to be substantially equivalent or something like that. That's the traditional 510K. I think something like 70% of 510Ks go the traditional route. The next type of 510K is the special 510K. The special 510K can be used in several situations, but the most common situation is if you're making a change to an existing medical device, a device that's already on the market here in the U.S. under the 510K, and you need to notify FDA of that change. It could be a change in the technology, it could be a change in the labeling, it could be many different types of changes, and you don't feel for whatever reasons that it's appropriate to handle that change internally via a letter to file. Then the special 510K would be the mechanism to be used to notify FDA of that change. The other type of 510K, the abbreviated 510K, which is very uncommonly used. The special 510K, by the way, is used about 20% of the time. The abbreviated 510K has only been used less than 5% of the time. This is when you make a substantial equivalence argument based on what I call a paper comparison. In other words, there's a guidance document, there's an industry standard, there's something, you're not comparing your device to another specific device. Instead, you're comparing your device to a standard that's applicable to all of those types of devices. And as we've talked about also, John, now the abbreviated 510K has been sort of morphed or resurrected, if you will, to now what's referred to as the performance-based 510K. So those are the major types of 510Ks. Am I forgetting any, John?
No, I don't think so. I just thought it would be helpful for folks because to give you like an example, I was recently having a conversation with a company, and they're looking at that traditional 510K. They're kind of looking for the I'll choose my words somewhat carefully, but anyway, they're looking for kind of the quick path, so to speak. We're not going to pick that one apart, but to get clearance for an initial indication for use, but then they were not entirely clear because they had their technology. They have additional use cases, indications, patient population, so on and so forth, that they want in the ultimate product. But they were looking at, their approach was, let's get a traditional 510K with an initial indication for use first. But then they were not clear as to, what other regulatory pathway options they had to leverage for adding indications, label expansions, and things of that nature. So in their scenario, the traditional might be the first foray or entry into the market, where maybe several months later they may follow on with like a special 510K and be able to use their own product as a predicate.
Absolutely correct, John. And again, this is going to be a high-level discussion, but let's use this as an opportunity to kick things up a notch or two. So you're right. Usually the quickest, simplest, cheapest, easiest way to get a device onto the market is with a traditional 510K, as long as you can tick those two basic requirements, less than class 3, and make a substantial equivalence argument. And by the way, John, let's also remind our audience that one of the most common reasons why 510Ks are rejected is because of substantial equivalence or the lack thereof. So that's not a trivial topic. But assuming that you can get your initial device on the market as a 510K with, say, a single indication, you can always go back to the FDA later in the form of a label expansion and add additional indications. That additional indication might be added via another subsequent traditional 510K. It might be added by a de novo. It might be added by many different things. It really depends on how different your indication, your new indication is compared to the last. But for those that are not familiar with the label expansion idea, John, the metaphor that I like to use is like in baseball. It's the difference between swinging for a single versus swinging for a home run. Everything else being equal, I would prefer to swing for a home run. But the problem is when you swing for a home run, you have a higher likelihood of striking out. So in this very risk-averse industry that we work in today, I like to give my customers another option. You don't want to swing for a home run. You don't want to bring a device onto the market with, 5 or 10 different indications at one time. Fine. Swing for a base hit. The batter gets up, they get a base hit. The batter runs to first. The next batter gets up, they get a base hit. The runner moves from first to second. At the end of the day, you end up at the same place. In other words, all the runners get around the bases. The question is, do you do it all at once, i.e. a home run or a grand slam, or do you do it as a series of baby steps, as individual base hits or doubles or triples and so on? So that's the idea of a label expansion. And of course, there are advantages and disadvantages to both. But again, I just want to emphasize, because I see a lot of people make this mistake, just because your previous device was brought onto the market as a 510K doesn't necessarily mean that your next device also has to be brought onto the market as a 510K. It may be a de novo or something else.
For sure. So folks, again, this is there are lots of twists and turns and nuances, and it's good to think your strategy out and make sure you have a thorough plan and understand the pros and cons of all these different options. It's not for the faint of heart. It's not always simple and trivial. There are, like I said, pros and cons. So, Mike, another thing that I think a lot of people that I talk with are confused about, well, there's a few things, and I thought we could explore each of those a little bit in more depth, but timing. When can I submit a 510K? And I guess I'll add a few more words to that. When during my product development process should I be at a point where I'm ready to prepare, compile, and submit my 510K submission to FDA?
Well, great question, John. And I think, in fact, it's two questions. One is when can you submit, and the second is when should you start preparing or thinking about it. So let's talk about when should you submit first. The simple answer to that question, John, is you can submit as soon as you get all your ducks in a row. In other words, as soon as you have all of your development work done. Obviously, you have to be at the point of design freeze. You need to have your final V&V, verification and validation testing all in order. You need to have all of your documentation in place. So basically, when you have all that stuff that goes into the 510K, that's when you can submit. Now, sometimes companies will ask me, there's one piece of information that's holding up the show. It could be, a sterilization validation. It might be some biocompatibility testing. So they ask me, is it possible for us to submit, say, 98 or 99% of the package? And then as soon as this additional information becomes available, we would submit that. In the past, John, in the regulatory vernacular, that's what we've called a promissory note. Basically, the company says, okay, we will submit, 99% of it, but the packaging validation, that will be available in 3 months, and we'll send that to you then. In the past, promissory notes have been accepted by the FDA. Today, they will still accept them, but they're very, very hesitant to do so. Why? Because regrettably, John, there have been companies that have promised to do things that have never, in fact, followed through. And as a result, FDA has gotten burned. And so they've become very cautious about accepting a promissory note. So my advice to companies today, John, and I would love to hear if you agree or maybe you have a different spin on this, is unless you really have extenuating circumstances, you really need to not rely on a promissory note and try to get everything submitted all together at one time if that's possible. Do you agree, John, or do you have a different view?
No, I just totally agree. And I go back to certainly early in my career and even probably, I don't know, just say a few years ago. I can't remember exactly, and time flies when you're having fun. But back in the day, you used to be able to do the I promise or the promissory notice for things like biocompatibility, for things like sterilization validation, for things like electromechanical safety, for things like shelf life. And I think there's still a common, I don't know how common, but I know I still talk to a lot of folks that still think they can do that. And I'm like, no, that's almost grounds for rejection. And we'll talk about the RTA piece here in a moment. But I haven't heard of a company being successful of the I promise statements in a 510K these days, especially for sort of those big hitters, if you will, of biocompatibility, sterilization, electrical safety, and packaging and shelf life and things like that. I think those days are gone.
Well, just to be clear, John, you can still do it. There's nothing technically that can prevent you from doing it. And I suspect one of the reasons why you haven't heard of it is because obviously information like that is not generally available, at least not publicly. I can tell you, based on my personal experience, that I still, on occasion, I am successful in getting FDA to accept a promissory note. Even recently, I've done that. But as I said, there needs to be extenuating circumstances. As we've talked about many, many times before, John, you have to decide, you have to choose to pick your battles, right? So if this is something that is worth fighting for, then I will do it on behalf of the company. But if it's not, then I won't. And one other thing I'll mention quickly, John, to transition us to your second question, and that is how early in the process do you start planning and thinking about this kind of stuff? If you think that a promissory note is in order for your particular product for whatever reasons, I would be taking that to the FDA in advance as part of my pre-submission meeting or pre-sub, just to let them know. That way, if there's a concern, we'll find out about it sooner rather than later, and you won't get dinged on a refuse to accept or something because of it.
Yeah, for sure. I think there are scenarios where it does make sense. So, like you said, pick your battles and do so wisely. A moment ago, you said a couple of keywords that I want to, explore a little bit further. And I might be paraphrasing a little bit, but you talked about the time to submit is when your development is, quote, done, and you're at a design freeze and you've completed verification and validation. Obviously a lot of these things that or maybe not obviously, but hopefully obviously a lot of the things that we're talking about, these I promise scenarios, technically speaking, those would be verification and or validation activities. So, folks, do keep that in mind, that you'll need to have as much of, if not all of that stuff done in order to be ready for a 510K submission. I guess thoughts about that before I dive in to the next couple of topics on this 510K discussion.
Well, the only other thing that I would remind our audience, you can go to the FDA's website and see in detail what, the different sections, the different types of the information that FDA is expecting to see in a 510K. One of the things that I want to just point out to our audience that you do not have to have for a 510K is you do not have to have FDA registration. That's a whole separate and distinct discussion. And that gets into, the quality management system and the design controls and all that kind of stuff. So you do not have to have any of those ducks in a row for a 510K. You obviously have to be FDA registered before you can market your product here in the United States. But strictly speaking, for a 510K, it's not necessary. And We have had some discussion at FDA. As you and your audience know, John, I work for a consultant to the agency as well, so I'm privy to some of these discussions. We have had some discussion in the agency about adding that kind of a requirement as part of the 510K. For the record, I've always been against it. Why? Because there's been a small number of medical devices that I've been involved with, granted not many, but a small number where the company wanted to get a 510K, but they never in a million years intended to manufacture or market or distribute that device. For example, they wanted to use that device as their own label expansion, as we talked about earlier, John, as a predicate, or they wanted to use that 510K to demonstrate competence to potential investors. In other words, here we've already got this simple device on the market. We're not going to market it, but we've got it through the FDA. Give us a bunch more money, and now we can do it again for a more complex device. So simply put, John, why should I jump through all of these manufacturing hoops to demonstrate that I can manufacture a product, a device, that I never, in fact, intend to manufacture? So that's the thing that I wanted to point out that was not included or not required as part of a 510K. It is some of those manufacturing requirements, as you know, are required in the PMA world, but not in the 510K or, for that matter, the de novo world.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I want to dive back into that one a little bit more in depth here in a moment. But I want to remind folks, I'm talking with Mike Drews. Mike is the president of Vascular Sciences and a regulatory pro, the best in the business. Certainly can help any of you listening today with sound regulatory strategies for getting your products to market. So definitely feel free to reach out to him and learn more about how he can help you. I also want to remind you all that Greenlight Guru, we're here to help as well. We have the only medical device QMS platform in the industry today. It's designed by medical device professionals for and only for medical device professionals such as yourself. So be sure to check that out. Go to www.greenlight.guru to learn more. Mike briefly mentioned the term design controls. I want to unpack that a little bit too, but we have specific workflows within the Greenlight Guru platform designed to help you document, manage, and maintain your design control, your design history file, your risk management activities. So many of our customers are in a similar situation as you. They're trying to get their products cleared, and they're finding great success on the Greenlight platform. So go check it out, www.greenlight.guru. Mike, you just mentioned something that I think is also a misnomer for a lot of people. They think that when they prepare their 510K submission, that they do need to submit the manufacturing related information, that they need to provide, their manufacturing process validation documentation. And there's a misnomer about their quality system. I think they're likening the 510K process similar to getting ISO certification and CE marking. So might be worth explaining folks a little bit about sort of the myths behind that.
Yeah, good question. So let's talk about that a little bit. So in the PMA world, if we're talking about class 3 devices, then there are manufacturing requirements that are that go into part of the PMA submission. Granted, the regulatory requirements for the PMA for manufacturing are very nebulous. They're very sort of vague, but there are manufacturing requirements in there. You have to include some amount of information about your manufacturing process in your PMA. How much information, that's very much subject to discretion, but you need to include some. And the reason, quite frankly, John, is because in the class 3 world, as you can appreciate, the devices are obviously higher risk, typically life-supporting or life-sustaining. They're typically indicated for more complex pathophysiologies, probably for patients that have more comorbidities. From an engineering perspective, the technologies for class 3 devices are often more complex than for class 2 or lower devices. So for all of those reasons, it makes sense that we include manufacturing information in a PMA submission. For the 510K, and as I mentioned for the de novo, John, there is no manufacturing requirement, at least right now. Again, we have had some discussions at the agency about including those. For the record, I'm actually in favor of including those because even though in general the 510K and de novo devices are less risky and simpler in technology compared to Class 3 devices. Still, in the 510K universe, our technologies are becoming more and more complicated all the time. And so as an engineer, I find it difficult to separate the design of the device from the process that we use to manufacture it. Those two things go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So we do not have to include those, but I sometimes will include them sort of as an optional section in a 510K, but obviously we're not required to do so, at least not right now.
Yeah, and I think that this is certainly a gray area topic all by itself. But I see a lot of companies when they learn this, that they get maybe a little too cavalier. They're like, oh, well, that means I don't have to do that design control stuff and that risk stuff and that quality management system stuff that you're always talking about, John. I can do that later. In fact, I had a company I was talking to the other day. They were evaluating whether or not Greenlight Guru might be a good option for them. And they're like, oh, well, we've been talking to this, quote, FDA consultant, and she told us that we didn't need to worry about any design controls, and we didn't need to worry about risk, and we didn't need to worry about anything quality system related until after we get clearance. And if I wasn't bald, I would have yanked the hair out of my head, because that is bad advice. That is bad advice.
Well, I'm glad you said it was the woman regulatory consultant, because that means that it was not me.
It was not you.
Let me be absolutely crystal clear, John, and I'm pretty sure that you'll agree with me on this. When I say that those kinds of things, your quality, your design controls, and so on, are not required as part of a 510K, of course that's factually correct. But by no means am I trying to imply that those things are not important and that we shouldn't do them. On the contrary, as you and I have talked about many times in the past, John, when it comes to design controls, everything in the design controls is what I call, prudent engineering, basic engineering, and we should be doing those things anyway. But you asked me the question, what are we required to do? What are we required to have for a 510K? And that's the basis of my response. Would you agree with that, John?
Absolutely. So let's move on to a couple other topics, I guess. The next topic that I hear a lot of confusion about is clinical evidence and whether or not it is required for my 510K submission. So what are your thoughts about that?
Great question, John. And as usual, I have a slightly different approach to all of this than many other people. Bottom line, there is no requirement anywhere in the 510K that says you do not have to have clinical data. And similarly, there's no requirement anywhere in the PMA that says you must have clinical data. In other words, a lot of people think that a 510K doesn't need clinical data, whereas a PMA does. It is absolutely not the case. The decision on whether or not you need clinical data, in my opinion, is not a function of the regulatory pathway. In other words, it doesn't matter if it's a 510K, de novo, PMA, HDE, whatever it is. The decision of whether you need clinical data is determined based on what my attorney friends like to call the totality of the evidence. In other words, if all of your evidence added together from benchtop testing, from subject matter experts, from the literature, from looking at predicates and so on, if the totality of your evidence is sufficient to show that your product is safe and effective, or to show that it's substantially equivalent, then likely you will not need any additional clinical data to shore that up. On the other hand, if the totality of your evidence is not sufficient to show those things, then you probably will need clinical data to shore that up. This goes right back to the most basic requirements of the 510K, John, which have not changed since the 510K was created in 1976. And that is, as long as your intended use is the same, your technology can either be the same or it can be different. Well, suffice it to say, the more similar your technology is to a predicate, the less likely you will need clinical data as part of your 510K submission. On the other hand, the more different your technology is, if, for example, your technological differences raises additional questions of safety and efficacy and or changes the overall risk, then you're probably going to need clinical data. So bottom line, it's not a binary decision, John. It's not I'm doing a 510K, therefore I do not need clinical data. Or alternatively, I'm doing a PMA, therefore I do need clinical data. It's a heck of a lot more complicated. And one other thing that I'll just mention quickly, John, and I would love to hear your response to this, because you're right, this is an area where a lot of people in our industry just don't understand. When I say it's not a binary decision, a lot of people ask me, do I need to do a clinical trial or not? That, to me, is not a binary decision. In other words, it's a matter of how much. In other words, if you're going to need to do a clinical trial, does it need to involve 10 patients or 100 patients or 1,000 patients, or, what's the number? So we don't live in a world that's black and white. We live in a world that's infinite number of shades of gray. And I mentioned briefly the pre-submission meeting, John. Most of my pre-submission meetings have three common questions. And the third question is almost always addressing the necessity for clinical data. In other words, we're not going to do a clinical trial. Here are all the reasons why. Or we are going to do a clinical trial, and this is what the trial design is going to look like, the number of patients, the number of sites, inclusion and exclusion criteria, endpoints, and so on and so on. All of that stuff, in my opinion, John, should be presented to the FDA long in advance of the submission in the form of a pre-sub meeting, and definitely not at the point of the actual submission itself.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that was going to be a question I was going to ask, so we might as well ask it now. So should we'll just leave it, any submission that I plan for FDA, should I always do a pre-submission? Or maybe a different way to ask the question, is there ever a scenario where I should not do a pre-submission in this day and age?
Well, that's a great question, John. Obviously, pre-submission meetings are not required, so no company is under any obligation to do one. But I can tell you the vast majority of devices that I'm involved with, it's become the rule rather than the exception to do the pre-sub meeting. I just think for a whole bunch of reasons, I look at it as cheap insurance. Are there situations where a pre-sub might not be warranted? Yeah, if you have a device, if you have a device that is what I call a slam dunk 510K. In other words, there's absolutely no question about substantial equivalence, and there's absolutely no question about risk, because remember, those are the two vital components of the 510K. You need to show substantial equivalence, and you need to address risk compared to the predicate. If there are no questions whatsoever, and all of the testing that you're planning on doing is all, sort of standard generic testing, and you're not worried about anybody asking for clinical data, and you don't think there's a possibility that FDA might not see this as substantially equivalent and therefore recommend a de novo, then sure, a company can proceed just directly to the submission and not bother with a pre-sub. But I don't know about you, John. In this world that we live in today, I don't get involved with that many slam dunk 510Ks anymore.
Yeah, nor do I. Fair point. All right.
And by the way, taking that one step further, because of all of the controversy that's gone on around the 510K in the last few years, much of that we've talked about in other discussions. I've taken devices to the agency where I thought were, very legitimate 510Ks, and FDA pushed back, in some cases pushed back hard, and said, we don't see this as a 510K. For example, it does introduce a new risk not in the predicate. In the case that I'm referring to, it was such an esoteric risk. It was kind of like the risk that the Earth could stop revolving around the sun tomorrow. It's a minuscule risk, right? But because they're taking a more literal interpretation of the 510K regulation, specifically the risk regulation. Remember, John, the regulation itself has not changed at all since the regulation was created in 1976, but FDA is taking a more literal interpretation of that risk regulation. And one step further, John, I see it vary from group to group within CDRH. So, for example, the orthopedic folks might have a slightly different take on risk than cardiovascular versus, OBGYN or something like that. So, bottom line, there aren't that many situations anymore where I would probably say to a company, you know what, it's not, you don't have to worry about a pre-sub. It's not worth it for you.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen very often anymore.
Yeah. All right. So I thought we could kind of start to, I guess, lead toward a wrap up of the conversation, but just a brief high level recap so far. So the time to submit a 510K is when your device is quote done and you have design freeze and you're through verification and validation. So, and again, folks, go to the FDA website. They have the table of contents and some explanation and guidance documents, et cetera, on the information that you need to provide within that 510K submission. So the details are there. It's pretty specific and pretty predictable, generally speaking, as far as what Section 1 is and what Section 2 is and so on and so forth. So do go to the FDA website for those specific details, and we'll provide a link to the text that accompanies this. But I thought we could start to wrap things up. So I put everything together in my 510K submission. I send it to FDA. Then what happens? I mean, we enter into this RTA phase. So what does that look like? And any tips or pointers for companies to get through that step?
So in a nutshell, John, the FDA review process can be broken into two steps. The first step is what we call the administrative review, and then the second step is what we call the scientific, or sometimes people refer to it as the substantive review. In the administrative review, this is where essentially a bean counter at FDA has your submission on one side of their desk and their refuse to accept or RTA checklist on the other. And they're literally going through section by section. Do you have this section? Check. Do you have this section? Check. Do you have this signature? Do you have that form? And so on. So bottom line, that's just administrative, right? And here's an interesting statistic for you, John. Back in 2013, 60% of 510Ks that were submitted to the agency, 60% of them were rejected on administrative review. Now, more recently, that number is hovering around 35 to 40%. But nonetheless, having a third or maybe as many as 2/3 of submissions being kicked back on administrative review, I think, quite frankly, is embarrassing as an industry. I've said many times that there's no reason why any submission should be rejected on administrative review. When that happens, that is 100% the company's fault. It is not the FDA's fault. And this is exactly why FDA has put out the refuse to accept guidance, not just for the 510K, which was finalized last year in 2019, but 3 other similar guidances were also put out and finalized last year. There's the equivalent of the RTA checklist for the PMAs, the RTA checklist for de novos, and the RTA checklist for pre-submission meetings. We can put links on the website to all of these guidances, John.
For sure.
Bottom line, we should make sure that our submissions are not rejected based on administrative review. The second step of the process is scientific review. This is when the FDA actually takes a look at what, in my opinion, is the most important stuff, the content of your submission. In other words, the logic of your substantial equivalence argument, the rationale of your risk mitigation strategy, the details of your testing matrix. Are you doing the appropriate testing? Are you doing the testing the right way? The analysis of your statistical data. Do they agree with your conclusions? All of that kind of stuff. If a submission, comes back because of questions or problems on scientific review, then that's fair game. That's FDA's job. And quite frankly, I say bring it on. But if a submission gets kicked back on administrative review, and by the way, one other thing I'll mention quickly, John, you and I in a recent discussion talked about the eStar program, the electronic submission template and resource form that's now available. All of these guidances that I mentioned a moment ago, the eStar program as well, these are all attempts for FDA to help industry minimize the problems that are happening on administrative review. Because even though the 510K has been around for nearly 50 years, John, people still screw it up in terms of the paperwork.
Yeah. And folks, the eStar pilot program that Mike mentioned, we did a recent podcast episode on that. It is on wherever you're listening to this podcast, you can find that. It was published about a week or so ago, or I guess mid-March. I guess I should specify the date because I don't know when this is going to go live. But the administrative review, you're right. I mean, it's good to hear that the industry has reduce the rejections, but it's still inexcusable. And folks, it's not like the FDA administrator is working from some super secret checklist. It is readily available to you. In fact, I encourage folks that are going through the 510K process to use the RTA checklist as of kind of their own final check before they submit it to FDA, and maybe even put comments into where that particular item can be found, what page number, what section, et cetera, and even include that as part of that submission that you send to FDA. So I don't know if those ever get read, but at least you're using this as a final QC, if you will. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I would agree with that, John, and I know we need to wrap this up, but I'll give a quick example. So one of the most common reasons why a submission is rejected on administrative review is because a section is missing. Well, my advice to companies is very simple. Put yourself in the shoes of a reviewer. If there's a section that's missing, the reviewer doesn't know why it's missing. In other words, is it missing because it's not applicable to your device, or is it missing because you just simply didn't know about it or forgot about it? So never leave a section blank. Always, at the very least, write not applicable if it's not, a section is not applicable to you. Like, for example, that's okay. I have lots of examples, but so at the very least, write not applicable. But usually, John, I take it one step further. I'll explain, why it's not applicable. There was a famous case, I've heard a few people reference this. A company failed to indicate that vinyl gloves do not contain software or met electrical safety requirements. So obviously, to anybody with an IQ of more than 5, they're going to understand that vinyl gloves don't contain software and don't, have electrical safety requirements. But don't just leave that section blank. Say that that section is not applicable because vinyl gloves don't contain software and they don't have any electrical components. Right. So what I want to try to do, John, is I want to demonstrate to my FDA friends that I know what the heck that I'm doing, that I'm not forgetting anything. As I said, put yourself in the shoes of the reviewer. They have no idea if you leave a section off or if you leave a section blank, why you're leaving it blank. This is exactly why, unfortunately, we have all these RTA guidances. This is exactly why we have the E-STAR program. This is exactly why we even have a few companies out there that are specializing in the software to help companies prepare 510Ks and other kinds of submissions, because I'm sorry, the 510K program has been around now for 50 years. There's no reason why we should still be having these administrative or paperwork problems.
I totally agree. And another common thing that I know you've shared in the past when you and I have talked is that statement called indications for use. It finds its way. I mean, there's a separate section in a 510K just for the indications for use, but that statement is repeated at least a handful of times in other sections of a 510K. And it is amazing how many times that statement is inconsistent with your a company's own submission. So folks, do yourself a favor and take care of the simple things. Let's hopefully we as an industry can reduce that administrative rejection down to a single digit percentage, because we still have a long way to go. And Mike, I know you and I could talk literally for days about 510Ks and submissions, and I'd like to leave it here for right now, folks. Some actionable tips and pointers, some suggestions for you all on how to manage the 510K process, a little bit more insights into what that looks like, when to do it, and those sorts of things. And certainly would encourage you to submit comments and feedback to Mike and me. As you know, he and I, we engage in episodes of the Global Medical Device Podcast every so often, and love to hear your feedback. What's important to you? What's going on in your world? What do you need some more tips, pointers, and guidance on? We'd be happy to engage in those topics. So, Mike, thank you so much for being my guest on this episode of the Global Medical Device Podcast.